Danny, I have to start off and say thank you for the prayers for Dad and his teaching. He always needs them. It's fair. I'd say the same about me. All right. We are doing a lesson this morning on the kingdom. Oh, before we start, welcome. That's my job this morning. Secondly, Sweetheart Banquet. If you don't know what that is, it's a banquet where we do fun things and eat good food, and you're served by little sweethearts who... Anyway, it's a banquet for everybody. Just an event, an activity, a fellowship, if you will, a use of the table, as Dan mentioned in his Lord's Supper talk, and it's for everybody. So if you want to be a part of it, come be a part of it. There's a list in the back-ish around that area, and let us know you're there so we have food for you. That's all. And that's February 20th. It'll be a Thursday night, 6 o'clock. Please, everybody, come. It'll be awesome. This will be our third one, too, and the first two have gone well. So hopes for the third one. We are talking about the kingdom, part 4, and we will see. We will see if we make it all the way through. My intuition is that we will not, and so we will probably have to have a part 5. But I want to start off by talking. In speech class, they tell you to start with the really exciting stuff first and get people's attention, right? Well, here's what I'm going to require from you this morning is the opposite of that will happen. Try to stay invested here. I promise it's going somewhere cool. At least I think it's cool. But we're going to talk about Gnosticism. Is anybody familiar with that? Gnosticism. It's really what it is it's like one of the first ancient denominations, kind of. It's an umbrella term. It's this big blanket term for a sort of practice or mispractice of Christianity in the first century. It's actually, if you are aware of it and are looking for it, you can see the New Testament writers arguing against it in their writings, particularly John in his gospel and in his 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and even I think a little bit in Revelation. If you're looking for it, you can see John is clearly making the case that Gnosticism is bad and not true. Here's what Gnosticism is, okay? Gnosticism is influenced heavily by what I am referring to as the Holy Trinity of philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. And they all together and sort of morphed this idea that there is a separation between the physical world and the spiritual world, that there is a physical thing that is tangible, touchable, real, and that there's a other thing that is spiritual and not tangible, touchable, or real, but not physical. And they separated those two. Now, that got brought forward, and in Gnosticism and through just the development of that thought, it began developing a good and a bad. So now, not just a separation, but a quality assigned. So physical equals bad, evil, gross, and spiritual equals good, enlightened, and healthy, and like good, heavenly, right? And so now, when Jesus comes onto the scene, and especially shortly after the church is established, there's this idea that the physical is bad and gross, and the spiritual is good and right. And so this Gnostic idea, the word Gnostic, you might recognize, gnosis is the Greek root, has the idea of to know. And so the Gnostics were the ones with knowing. You might call them the enlightened ones, the ones who understood the secret knowledge. That's where that name kind of comes from. So they had this secret knowledge that the physical was evil and the spiritual was good. And that led them to an understanding of Jesus that was entirely unbiblical. Okay? If Jesus was God, then he could not be physical. If Jesus was man, then he could not be God, because these two are oil and water. One is bad and one is good. And so if Jesus was, this would be the Gnostic interpretation, if Jesus was in fact a man, and these were sticking points, I'm not trying to be crass, but these were sticking points, used the restroom and bled and did other vile things such as these. If Jesus was a man, then that would disqualify him by nature from being God or spirit at all. And if Jesus was God, this was an actual theory, was the person that we knew must have been some sort of projection. That was their way of rationalizing this physical evil, spiritual good concept with what Jesus embodied. All right, this while it seems like it's a very far away, silly idea, is actually not that far. First of all, there are going to be a lot of people who have some sort of idea associated with Gnosticism still. It's definitely still prevalent in the thought about Jesus. So in one way, it's good to know some of this stuff because then you can talk with other people about it. But also, just the general baseline idea that sort of empowers Gnosticism of physical bad, spiritual good is very much permeating our culture today. In our church, our religious culture today as well. There is a sense in which every time we read Paul talk about the flesh, and I think Paul does this to some extent, it's evil and bad and not good. And every time Paul talks about the spirit, it is good. And so the divide between physical and spiritual is further reinforced in our mind as we read that. Here's the problem, though, is we have kept this separation as like a prominent part of the way that we think about the world. That in our world, the physical things of our world are bad, and I would say we're more balanced generally. We wouldn't say going and playing golf is evil or gross. We wouldn't say that going and doing physical things is like inherently wrong, like the Gnostics might. But we would say that it's not spiritual, right? We would say golf is not spiritual. We would say spiritual things are different. Like you have your category of physical, earthly things, and then spiritual, godly things. And we separate those two significantly. I don't think that's any more obvious than in youth group activity. I don't know, separation criteria, categories, youth group activity categories. That's the word I was looking for. When you are working with youth, you have two different types of activities. You have the fun activities, the physical, right? And then you have the spiritual activities, which are the spiritual stuff, right? Now, here's the deal is, in this category, you have things like Six Flags, fun, right? You have things like maybe a lock-in, where you go stay up all night and play games at a church building or some community center or something. And then on the other side, you have the spiritual things that you do with the kids, like Devo. Like Devos, those are spiritual activities. Or if you do like a prayer night, or sometimes we would consider maybe like a service activity, a spiritual activity, right? Now, so we have our categories here in youth. I think the problem is those categories and that way of understanding the world is wrong, not biblical. I don't think the Bible sees those categories the same way that we do. And here's what I mean, because one of the ways that you can see that something is wrong is by the problems it creates. And that idea of separating the physical and the spiritual causes a couple of really big problems. First of all, I would say probably the biggest problem it causes is that it creates a life for a Christian, most of which is not spiritual. If your categories are physical and spiritual, and spiritual is just praying, reading your Bible, worshiping, then most of the Christian life is not spiritual, right? Let's just be as reasonable about this as we can. If you just take the amount of time that you sleep, plus the amount of time that you eat, plus the amount of time that you work, if you took the rest of the time and devoted your entire rest of your time to spiritual things like reading the Bible, praying, or worshiping, you'd be out of balance. Most of the Christian's life would not be, as we would call it, spiritual. And so that would create a big problem because now your spiritual life is a part of your life, but not your whole life. I don't know that that's the picture we're meant to get from the scripture. Secondly, if we take the physical and the spiritual concept and we play that out to its most logical conclusion, in order to give your whole life to God and to be entirely a spiritual person, fully devoted, you would rapidly descend into a system of monks and nuns. That was actually exactly why that system began, was because certain men and women wanted to devote their whole selves to spiritual practices. And so then they decided they were going to form these monasteries, and that these men would come and be monks, and they would spend the entirety of their days praying and reading or studying the Bible and worshiping and not doing anything else. That was all they did, right? And intuitively, I think, all of us see a little bit of a problem with that, but we also feel the pull of, isn't that what we're supposed to do? It creates a little bit of a conflict, a little bit of friction, because that is the logical conclusion of this system. And yet, the vast majority of Christians will not take that path. You could almost say most Christians won't give their whole life, if that's what giving your whole life looks like. Again, this is a problem that is a symptom of this misinterpretation of what our world is and how it works, separating the physical things from the spiritual things. So, like I said, the biggest problem, though, is that the Bible doesn't see the world this way. So we're going to look at a passage look at Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6. It's a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus, and as he is wrapping up this letter, which is one of Paul's shorter letters, but not one of the shorter letters in the world, actually an anomaly of a long letter, Ephesians is. Paul's wrapping up this whole argument, and he gets to his finally in verse 10. He's spent a lot of time talking about unity, how the gospel should produce unity, how we're saved because of the gospel, how this should impact how we live as Christians, walking in love. And then he gets to this wrap-up in verse 10. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 10, he says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Does anyone else feel lions and tigers and bears, oh my vibes? Yeah, a little bit, right? Like Paul's just kind of adding to these scary things. Now, here, I want to pause here and ask, what is he talking about? I think generally, tell me if I'm wrong, I know I've done this. Generally, we read this verse and we go, don't get it, it's kind of freaking me out, skipping past it. We don't really sit in it and say, hold on, is what I'm doing engaging in war against authorities and the cosmic power over this present darkness? How many of us go through our day-to-day life thinking about the cosmic powers of this present darkness? Like, not a lot. Do many of us sit down and really know what it means that we're battling against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places? Like, no, we don't really. So here's the way this could be interpreted, and why we generally shy away from it is because a lot of people will take this and they'll say, Wicca. This is the dark arts. This is magic and scary stuff. Now, okay, I don't think that's right. So I think our hesitance to jumping into that with 2 feet is absolutely right. But then what is it? Right? If it's not that, then what is Paul talking about? What is this battle? How does it happen? He seems to almost give it to them offhandedly, like everyone understood it. Well, let's finish his train of thought and see if he gives us a little bit more clue as to what he's talking about here. Therefore, in verse 13, he says, "Take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints, and also for me, that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare boldly as I ought to speak." So, here's Paul's solution to being prepared for this very weird spiritual stuff that makes us uncomfortable. Belt of truth. So truth would be the opposite of, or a way in which we would engage this spiritual battle. Righteousness, peace, faith, salvation, prayer. Okay. So the solution to this battle, or the way that we're going to fight in this battle, is with these things. And Paul describes the battle as spiritual. So what do we mean by spiritual? Paul seems to think spiritual means truth and righteousness and peace. These things that they're a part of our life every day, are they not? Has anyone told the truth today? Yes, all of us, when we said a true thing about God in a song, or when we said, no, you probably shouldn't wear that this morning to our spouse or our friend, right? Like we've all told the truth in some way today. And Paul sees the truth as a spiritual weapon. Spiritual warfare, you use the truth. He seems to think that peace is a thing that you use in the spiritual battle. Now, this is a bit odd, because these are normal things, and then that one verse is not normal to us. But Paul sees it to be connected, that peace and truth and righteousness and faith, like these things, these normal things, are how we engage in this spiritual thing, the spiritual battle that he talks about. Paul is not the only one. When we ask, what do we mean by spiritual, we have to look at the way Jesus talks. And, I mean, is there a better place in the whole Bible than the Sermon on the Mount? I don't know. As Jesus talks about, I just feel like I've gone to the Beatitudes every single time, every single lesson for the last year and a half. But Matthew chapter 5 and verse 3, Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who persecute you for righteousness' sake. Blessed are those who are persecuted, for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Let's just take a couple of these and ask the question, is it spiritual or is it physical? Peace. Peacemakers. Peace. Did anyone bring it with them today? Could someone take out of their pocket really quickly and hand me some peace? That's a very weird question, right? Because what is peace? Well, it's not a physical thing, certainly. So what is it? How do you hold it? How do you quantify it? You cannot. It's a spiritual force, right? Okay, can someone pull out their humility for me and hand it up front so we can all get... No, you can't. Humility is not a physical thing. You can't touch it or quantify it. It's a spiritual force. Okay, let's look at a couple of these other things Jesus says. If you skip ahead in verse 21 of Matthew chapter 5, you have heard it said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to the judgment. But I say to you, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment, and whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So let's ask this. What's often said about Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is that he is taking the perspective of the people listening, the Jews in particular, from the physical to the spiritual, right? That's what he says. And I think that's a right assessment of what Jesus is doing. He says, listen, you've heard it said, don't murder, don't physically murder. I'm telling you, don't even hate. What is hate? How do you hold hate? How do you touch and hold? You don't. It's a spiritual force that works within you. The inverse of hate would then be love, a spiritual force that is not quantifiable or tangible or holdable. He also does this with lust. He says, you've heard it said in verse 27, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So listen, this is not about the physical act. It is about the spiritual force of desire, misplaced desire, inappropriate desire. It's about the spiritual force of self-control, pulling back on that desire. That's the battle. Not just the how do you know if you win that battle? Well, it's a spiritual battle. It's kind of hard to quantify. Now, you think about one more in verse 33. Jesus says, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than that comes from evil. Well, what's he doing here? He's not just saying don't lie, right? That would be really easy. Hey, don't lie. He's saying, don't require your word to be upheld by an oath. your honesty should be so overwhelmingly certain that you don't need to swear by anything. You just say yes, and people know. That's as good as done. Okay, so dishonesty, why do you have to swear by things? Because you haven't kept your word in the past, right? So there's a battle between dishonesty or lying or deceit and truth and honesty. It's a spiritual battle. It's not a physical thing. You can't hold honesty in your hand. Now, the Bible certainly sees this differently. It certainly understands spiritual things to be a bit different than we understand them to be. And I think you can put other things into this category, and I think the Bible bears this out, things like relationship. You can't hold or touch relationship. It's a spiritual force. Things like bonding or trust. You can't hold or touch these things. Things like respect. It's not a tangible thing. It is a spiritual force. So Paul seems to think we're engaged in a spiritual battle and that we do that by these spiritual activities. Jesus seems to think that the more important things of life are these spiritual things, right? Okay, I think we're all pretty comfortable with that. Maybe the concept is a little bit unfamiliar, but that mostly tracks. Christianity is a spiritual thing. Now, when Judgment Day comes and Jesus returns, what are we going to be judged on? Well, it seems if you read through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus would say you're going to be judged on your spiritual well-being. How did you do? Were you a spiritual person? Did you practice the things that you're meant to practice spiritually, right? It's not about the physical. It's about the spiritual. But in Matthew 25, Jesus gives a description of what Judgment Day is going to look like. And you can turn over there and we'll read it. Matthew 25, starting in verse 31. It says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. For you were spiritual people.'" Right? If this is the criteria that we all are comfortable with, that this is a spiritual war and a spiritual battle, we should anticipate the criteria of coming and inheriting eternity with God to be a spiritual thing, right? It's not. In fact, there's no mention of the spiritual involved in this. He says, because I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And then the righteous will answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? Or when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." How much of that was about relationship? How much of that was about peace? How much of that was about trust? How much of that, you notice, to Jesus, you can't separate them. Your judgment will be determined on the physical. And also the things that matter in the world are the spiritual. So either Jesus is contradicting himself or he sees the world differently than we do. He understands that the world is not a physical place or a spiritual place. It is a fully integrated place of both. To put it in a different way, every single thing that you do is both physical and spiritual, and everything that you do physically impacts you spiritually, and everything that you do spiritually can impact you physically, because they're connected. Now, again, this is what I believe the Bible teaches about this subject. I don't think the Bible wants us to separate spiritual activities and physical activities. In fact, let's go back to our example of the youth group categories of activities. Six Flags. No one, at least at the beginning of the lesson, would argue that Six Flags is a spiritual activity, would you? I mean, for crying out loud, maybe you see some hallucinations because of the heat in the summer, but it's not enjoyable for me even. So like it's not a spiritual activity. Well, hold on. Does Six Flags facilitate relationships? Is there a sense in which Six Flags facilitates bonding and trust between friends? Maybe there's a spiritual component to Six Flags. Now, I don't like to say that because I don't particularly love going to Six Flags, but the point is there's both in everything. Maybe there's a physical component to the spiritual activities. Does anybody remember how difficult, and maybe some of you online are still experiencing how difficult it is to feel connected in worship with the church through a video camera? There's a physical component to the church meeting that is, I don't want to say fully required, but incredibly important. You're missing out on something if you're not able to actually sit down together, to read together, to breathe and sing together. You're missing something because the spiritual stuff we do requires the physical to be a part of it. And the physical stuff we do has spiritual implications. Like, I'm still categorizing them because it's kind of how I think, because it's kind of how all of us tend to think in our culture. But the truth of the matter is, it's not how Jesus thought. It's not how Paul seemed to think. It's not how the world works. Our world is intimately connected, physical and spiritual. And I think that this is probably the best example of this that I could come up with. And so I don't want to detract from what we're talking about, but intimacy, physical intimacy between partners is an excellent example of this. There was a revolution in the 60s that coincided with birth control, ironically, that where people began to say, sex is just a physical act. Doesn't matter. Doesn't have any bearing on you. You can do it with whoever you want, whenever you want, however many times you want, and it doesn't matter if it's just because it's just physical. Well, I mean, Christians have always had a problem with that because spiritually it's a sin and sin separates you from God. And so we've been able to put that part into place. But in the right context, most would concede it is just a physical act. Psychology, however, has discovered that your ability to intimately connect with people, to trust people, to build relationships with people, are all significantly damaged proportional to the number of sexual partners that you have. Your physical impacts your spiritual is, at this point, a scientific fact. Again, it's not the way that we see the world. And that is the challenge. We're going to have to stop. We didn't make it. That is the challenge this morning. Change the way you see this world to the way that Jesus sees this world. Try and see the world the way that Jesus sees the world, the way that the world really is. Because the world is a place with both physical and spiritual parts to it that coexist intimately and are unable to be disconnected from one another. This makes a lot of sense out of the passages where Paul says things like, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. Whatever you work at it mightily as if you're working for the Lord and not for man. Yeah, because everything you do has a spiritual impact in the world. It makes a lot of sense. Now, it also makes sense of some of the instruction that Paul gives people. Some of this is probably for the next lesson, but I want to give just two examples of this real quickly. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, Paul says, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, his family, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now that is a really challenging verse if the physical and the spiritual are separated. But there is a truth in this that non-Christians see plainly. If you claim to be a Christian and you've got your family starving because you won't go to work and you won't try to get a job, non-Christians look at you as being a hypocrite. How can you claim to be a Christian and not provide for your family? It's unbelievable, unfathomable to a non-Christian. Well, they see the connection. Paul clearly sees the connection between the physical and the spiritual. Getting up and going to work is a spiritual act. Providing for your family is a spiritual act because everything has a spiritual impact that you do. The physical and the spiritual cannot be separated. Titus chapter 2, in verse 3, Paul is talking to the women, giving them instruction. He says, older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They're to teach what is good, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children. Okay, that's a very non-spiritual thing, isn't it? How simple and common to love your husband and your children. Actually, Paul sees this as fully integrated life of the physical and the spiritual. It is an act of spiritual war to love and raise your children. It is an act of a spiritual war to love and care for your husband, according to Paul. That's what the older women are meant to teach the younger women. Notice not how to pray, right? Notice not how to lead women's Bible studies, but there's something more and real and permeating to every step of your life involved in this to Paul. The physical and the spiritual are intimately connected and unable to be separated. Like I said, we really don't have enough time to tie this into the kingdom. Maybe some of you are already trying to make the jump in connection, and I think it's a worthwhile connection and will be a lot of fun, but part 5 will have to wait. I want to look at one last thing as we close. Jesus, we've talked about his teaching and the way that he sees the world. But Jesus himself, he is the penultimate example of the physical and the spiritual being intimately connected and inseparable. Was Jesus' life physical or spiritual? If you ask Jesus, I heard a teacher say this once. He said, if you ask Jesus, you walked up to him, you're like, hey, man, how's your spiritual life doing? He would look at you like you had 4 heads. What are you talking about? My spiritual life. My life is spiritual. Jesus' life was dedicated to loving and serving other people and teaching and being with and laughing and crying and spending time with people in this world, physically and spiritually. Maybe just totally. What's a better word? I got to quit separating them, right? Entirely, integratedly. I don't know. He just was both of those things all the time. Okay, maybe that's a bit too broad. Was the cross physical or spiritual? I can't pick. Because yes, he was on the cross. He died. He actually bled. By all accounts, the Romans were really good at killing people. He really actually died. He felt the pain. People watched him. But what happened at the cross was spiritual, right? It was a sacrifice that was able to forgive sins. It was a death by the innocent on behalf of the guilty. It was a spiritual act of warfare that was a physical thing that happened. Jesus is the ultimate example of this, the overlap between the physical and the spiritual. I hope, if nothing else, we have laid the foundation today for you to see the world the way Jesus does, for you to see the world the way that it really is, as a fully integrated physical and spiritual experience that we are here partaking in, that Jesus partook in, and that should, if this groundwork is true, shape the way that we interact with the world, period. Everything we do is both physical and spiritual, just like Jesus' life, just like the cross. And this should shape how we live our lives as well. If you are not a Christian, then this story about Jesus on the cross is really important. You need to hear the whole thing in its context, and it's powerful, and it's true, and it's physical, and it's spiritual, and it's incredible. And I'd love to show you just right here what the Bible says about it and why it's so significant. And if you are a Christian and you need prayers of the church, man, we love you. So come forward and let us love you and tell us what you need, and we'll help you while we stand and sing.